We've been exploring Macmurray's idea of a unity pattern. It can be understood as an underlying logical framework or an integrating principle. It allows us to make sense of the world. And for Macmurray, there are three distinct unity patterns for each mode of reality: the material, the organic, and the personal. I want to briefly explore the idea of a unity pattern using a metaphor. Consider going into a furniture showroom. There's a mass of furniture there, as yet undifferentiated. It's just furniture. And that's kind of how we experience the world initially, as an undifferentiated other. We give attention to a particular object, and that then arrives in our house as a pile of pieces. So when we give attention to something in our environment, it arrives in our head as a pile of sense data. In order to construct that piece of furniture, we need a map, a set of instructions. We also need a tool, and it has to be the right tool. Only the right tool will do. So we see by analogy that in order to construct an idea in our head from the pile of sense data that's arrived there, we need a map, a set of instructions, an integrating principle. We need the right tool. And this is part of what Macmurray is referring to by the notion of a unity pattern. Now, Macmurray tells us that there are three modes of reality which can be understood as being nested within each other. And he argues that each one of those has its unique logical tool which allows us to unlock it, to understand it, to explore it. Now, we've explored the integrating principle, the logical tool behind the material world. Likewise with the organic world, the world insofar as it grows and develops. What we need to do now is to try to uncover the logical tool, the integrating principle of personal experience, of the world that we experience by virtue of being persons. Before continuing, I want to say a couple of words about the terms positive and negative, as we're going to be using them a lot. The first is that there's no value judgment associated with them. Positive is not better, negative is not inferior. They're purely logical distinctions. In philosophy, the terms tend to be used more generically than in, say, mathematics, but there are certain conventions in their use. Positive usually refers to existence or presence or towards that which is fully real. Negative is basically just the opposite of those things: non-existence, non-presence, towards that which is partially real. So with that in mind, we're ready to start exploring Macmurray's understanding of personal experience. What follows, of course, is a very simplified version of Macmurray's meticulously reasoned argument. Macmurray starts by examining the distinction between doing and thinking. He argues that in action, we meet the world as existence, as real, as there. And part of what he means by this is that we meet the resistance of the world. In thought, by contrast, we know the world as idea. Now, Macmurray would argue that the idea of a rock is logically and qualitatively quite different from our experience of knowing it through action. An idea is an abstraction, a representation, and has no concrete existence, whereas in action we meet the concrete existence of that which is not us, the other, an aspect of the world. He argues that the two are logically opposed to one another. They are logically opposite. So Macmurray concludes action is primary. It's there that we meet the world as existent and real, and therefore is logically positive. In thought, he argues, is secondary. It's derivative. It's not the real world as we meet it, but a representation of it, and it should be seen as logically negative. We see then that in Macmurray's thinking, action and thought are logical opposites to one another. We see the contrast between the real and representation of the real, between existence and non-existence. I can't pick up a thought and give it to you. Macmurray expresses this formally in the statement, thought is the logical negation of action. Macmurray goes on to explore the nature of action. He notes that action always includes thought. Indeed, it is partly our capacity for thought that makes action intentional. Oops, missed that one. But there's a curious asymmetry about it. We can withdraw from action into pure thought, but we cannot withdraw from thought into pure action. So, for example, this guy's day of hunting involved intense thought. There was tracking, first of all, predicting the movement of his prey, throwing the spear with exactly the right amount of effort. At the end of the day, he can sit around the fire and reflect on the day's hunting, maybe celebrate the achievements or think about improved strategies for the next day. He has withdrawn from action into reflection, into thought. Macmurray argues that action necessarily contains and is constituted by thought, but thought is the negation of action. That's what we've argued previously. So we have the curious situation in which action includes and is constituted by its own negation, namely thought. Now, Macmurray argues that this is not merely some kind of curious paradox, but gives us the clue to an underlying logical integrating principle. What we've uncovered is a logical form and a unity pattern in which the positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. So here we have it. The positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. This is the unity pattern that we've been looking for, that Macmurray calls the form of the personal. Here it is again. Now, because this is so abstract and unfamiliar, I'm going to start off by exploring it rather playfully using a metaphor that is familiar to most of us. Let us start by examining a donut. Now, the quintessential quality of a donut is that it has a hole in it. But there's something quite curious about this, for a donut contains within it something which is completely different in quality. The donut is made of stuff, but it is constituted partly by something which is not stuff. But a donut without a hole, well, it's simply not a donut. We see here then An interesting example of an asymmetric polarity. The positive contains and is constituted by its own negation. By the same token, we see that action is a positive which contains and is constituted by its own negation, thought. So we see that action is a bit like the whole donut. As we start to explore the form of the personal, we'll start to develop a simple notation for it. And as we discover layers of complexity, so we'll need to develop notation to reflect this. But before doing that, in the next lecture, we're going to explore the logic of the form of the personal using some everyday examples of asymmetric polarity. The aim is to make this rather abstract concept more concrete.